Look at anything that improves a human. It often requires going through discomfort. If I want to get fit, improve my fitness, that is going to be uncomfortable. Those workouts are going to suck, right? If I want to, let's say I'm overweight and I'm like, man, I need to take my health back and lose some weight, you're probably going to have to be hungry. That's uncomfortable. You know, even improving your relationships in your life often requires having conversations with people that can be uncomfortable. Like this idea, no pain, no pain, it's kind of bullshit to me. I mean, you look at how humans have improved themselves since day one, and there has always been challenge. I mean, think back even to traditional rites of passage. You know, these traditional societies would start with a younger person usually who was at, say, step 1 in their life, and they're like, we need to get this person to step 2. What did they do? They didn't just say, okay, now you're at step 2, buddy. They would send them out into the woods to go do something rather challenging, pretty epic. But along that way, in battling and having those challenges, the person would learn something about themselves, grow, become more confident, more competent, and they'd move on to that step 2 in life. I mean, you see this in, for example, the Maasai tribe. They would send young warriors out on a lion hunt. If you were able to spear a lion, then you would become a warrior. A lot of Native American tribes, similar thing. We're going to send a person out into the wild without food, water for a few days, and they're going to learn something about themselves through that challenge. I mean, these are, you know, Joseph Campbell talks about this in Hero with a Thousand Faces. Like, these myths are embedded into humanity. So if someone is saying that that's not the case, it's like, well, you're going against like millions of years of human tradition, but okay.
Need motivation?
Watch a Top 10 with Believe Nation.
Top 10, I got a top 10. Got my motivation high for my top 10. Gotta learn from the wise women and men. All my life, like na 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 na. For my top 10, top 10, na 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 na. This one's for my top 10.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more. And you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Michael Easter, and my take on his top 10 rules for success. Enjoy. Rule number 2, appreciate the challenges.
If you look at young people today, especially so people born after 1990, you see this rise in helicopter parenting because there was these like media stories about kidnappings, really high profile stuff. Now, kidnappings weren't even increasing as a whole, but there was just high profile ones, right? So all of a sudden parents are like, I can't let my kids go outside into the woods or at a park. But by doing that and having that time alone, where you sort of challenge yourself as a kid, right? I mean, think about your own experience at the playground or in the woods. Like, I learned a lot out there. My mom was basically like, yeah, come down by sundown. You know, she wouldn't know what I was doing. It was just, I was out doing stuff. That stops happening for kids. And so this like idea of challenge in a lot of different ways gets removed, because not only are you physically challenged, right, when you are going out doing stuff in the woods, but also like, your worldview gets challenged. Think about interactions on the playground. I got punched in the face on the playground a lot. I probably deserved it sometimes, and I learned something from
Michael, that may say something about you.
Yeah. When that goes away, all of a sudden kids don't have challenges. And so now you have this generation where, because they have not been challenged, what they consider a challenge is something like, you know, I'm a professor at UNLV. So if they say something, you know, have a point, and I push back on that, well, all of a sudden that's kind of scary, because you've never been punched in the face on the playground, right? So that becomes scary. Like in my classes, I'll bring up stuff and no one wants to say anything because, well, what if, you know, what if someone challenges me? Or like there's, people, younger people especially, I think, are a little more sensitive to a lot of the stuff we're talking about here. And as a result of that, you see levels of anxiety and depression. They're higher in the generations born after 1990 than any other generations that came before them, like significantly. They're up like 30 and 50%.
Rule number 3, practice rite of passage.
We've definitely crept into a lot of easiness in a lot of ways in our lives, and we've removed a lot of challenge. And, the world is very comfortable. And while this is obviously great in many ways, I think that we've tipped the balance so far that we don't have these moments that steal us anymore and build our character and make us more grateful for everything we have, all these amazing things we do have. You mentioned rite of passage with your son. That's one thing that we don't really do anymore at a grand scale, right? And there is a very good reason that cultures throughout time and space have, there is a young man who is at point A in his life and he needs to get to point B. They don't just hand over the keys to the kingdom and say, have fun, right? They usually make that person go out and do something challenging in nature, because along the way, they learn something about themselves. They become more competent. They become more confident. And then they're sort of able to transition to this point B where they need to be able to sort of be a real contributor to the tribe.
Rule number 4, carry more weight.
At the end of the day, I'm a gangly rider, but I'm a gangly rider who's been sent into some pretty extreme physical fitness environments and tests. And carrying that caribou was the hardest thing I've ever done. And it got me thinking about what the human body is built for. So if you look at the research, humans are built the way they are for 2 reasons. One is so we could run long distances in the heat. So humans are, relative to other animals, pretty athletically pathetic. We are not super fast. We're not that strong. We're not that agile. But what we are good at is going relatively slow for a really long time. Just keep going, right? We're good at marathons, things like that. And so we would use this to our advantage as we evolved. On really hot days, we would run animals down for miles and miles and miles, and they would eventually overheat because they're not as good at cooling themselves. And then we would spear them. And then we would have to do the second thing we're really good at. We would have to carry the weight back to camp. So we have adaptations like really strong hands, these sort of short torsos, strong midsections, all this stuff that make us really good at carrying. And, you think about how people exercise today. A lot of people jog. A lot of people do the running thing. But how many people are carrying weight across distance as a workout? Not too many. So I traveled to Harvard to learn a lot more about this from some of their anthropologists. And the guy that I spoke with and spent time with said, it seems that doing the exercises and physical activities that we were built to do seems to be uniquely beneficial for us, for our health, for our fitness. And so it got me thinking that we should carry weight over distance more. And I wanted to know, who is doing this and what have the effects of it been? And I realized that the only group that's really put carrying back into their lives at scale are special forces soldiers. So they do this via rucking. And rucking is essentially adding weight to a backpack and walking. It sounds simple, but this is the foundation of special forces training. And it has really morphed them into sort of the fittest band of humans to walk Earth, right? I think a lot of people mistakenly think that special forces training is the crap they see on the Discovery Channel, where it's like, we're going to do some burpees in the surf and get yelled at. That happens, but that's like an hour of 2 weeks. Most of it is rucking. So I traveled down to Jacksonville, Florida, to meet a guy who's a Green Beret, and he started this company called Go Ruck. And they've sort of, they sell these backpacks they're really beautifully built, so you can use them in a city, but they're designed for rucking. And so he's created this sort of community of people who ruck. And the beauty of rucking is that you're hitting cardio and you're hitting strength in one. People need to do more endurance work. We need to do more strength work. And he sort of describes it as cardio for people who hate running and lifting for people who hate the gym. So running tends to be hard on people's joints. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's because we sit a lot of the day. Our movement isn't great. We're also relatively heavy humans now because we're just big people now. But rucking doesn't really have that high of an injury rate at all. yet it has equivalent cardio benefits to running, burns 2 or 3 times the calories of walking, and you're also getting a lot of that strength work in. And it's just, you're doing what your body was built to do. It's really accessible, really easy, really great for you. And especially if, I realize this is professional development, but if you are a woman or if you're a woman listening to this, it's really great for women because it's really great at improving bone density. And falls are one of the main ways that women get in trouble when they're older. You know, you break a hip, you only have a 50% chance of surviving if you're over 65. And rucking tends to really build denser bones, especially for women because they start to lose bone densities.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, do different things.
Part of recovering from alcohol, for me at least, is realizing that it's doing push-ups in the parking lot, right? Like I always have to be conscious of that.
What does that mean?
It means it's always in me, right?
That you have the desire to drink.
Yeah. And obviously it fades a lot over time.
And
but
the push-ups in the parking lot are a distraction, or is that a metaphor?
Push-ups in the parking lot are a metaphor for what the disease is doing. It's always there, right? It's sort of like, it's not like it just fades away.
Right.
It's ready to come get me.
How in our own selves, there are things that we don't see and understand.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think a big thing for me was, you know, when you get sober, you have to ask yourself some hard questions about why did you drink the way you drank, you know? And I think that for me, I think part of it is genetic. You look at my family line and, you know, the men in my family, we got jail and prison records a mile long, you know, and it's just always been that way. So I think that there is something genetic. But I also think that, you know, that gene doesn't necessarily bloom unless you give it enough alcohol. So, you know, having to ask those hard questions. And I think that going through the process of getting sober, it's sort of like compared to like unpeeling an onion about yourself. It's like more will be revealed, you know, but you have to kind of go out and do different things that challenge you, that challenge your worldview in a lot of different ways, because by never putting yourself in a position where you are uncomfortable, whether that is physically or mentally or with, you know, what you think to be true, you're not going to learn anything about yourself, right? And I think that in today's age, it's a lot easier to never be forced out of your comfort zone. Now, physically, that's very obvious, right? I mean, you could take 1,000 steps a day and live today.
Rule number 6, live fully.
When you look at a lot of people don't embrace discomfort, it's like, well, it's not shocking. It's like, well, why the fuck would you? You've got 2.5 million years of evolution telling you don't be uncomfortable. That's a dumb idea. Your brain is screaming at you not to. So there needs to be this moment where you have this realization and tipping point that like, oh, always leaning into comfort is causing a problem in my life. And I have to push back against that. Because if you don't, you're just going to keep slipping. And we're seeing that with what's happening in society right now. I mean, just take the epidemic of obesity. I mean, that is the number one driver of health problems, of chronic disease. It's like people today, we might be living longer than ever on average. But are we actually living? Like there's a difference between lifespan and health span. You know, if you really want to live a full life, you're not going to look back at your life and be like, wow, I'm so glad that I watched Netflix and ate Domino's every night. Like, you're going to look back at your life at the end of it and be like, man, I did some pretty rad shit. I did Spartan events. I climbed mountains. I did X, Y, and Z. Like, you need to reinsert these sort of metaphorical lions back in your life if you really want to live fully and be healthy as well.
Rule number 7, get a balance.
We are now healthier in some ways, but not others. So for example, we don't get communicable diseases, but we do suffer from chronic diseases that were literally non-existent until like the last 100 years. So the top killers are
obesity, right?
Yeah. So things like heart disease, certain cancers, chronic lung diseases. These are all things that weren't really around until we made our world a lot more comfortable. So like, yes, we're living longer. The things that have really helped us live longer, though, are not all these new crazy medical technologies. Those have helped. But people really started living longer after we started washing our hands relatively regularly, after we got clean water treatment, after we started treating sewage. I mean, these are all very basic public health things. So I think that what has happened is that we've tipped the balance a little too far, right? There's this sweet spot. So if you think of it like a U-shaped curve where, really, really rough tumble, those maybe aren't good for us. We don't maybe live as long. But then when we get to the other side, if we are really sanitary and really safe and really whatever, that seems to hurt our physical and mental health. It's like, yes, we live longer now, but are we really, quote unquote, living, in a lot of ways? I think off the top of my head, how we over medicalize everything nowadays. So you look at our medical spending and how, if anyone has this ailment, we tend to treat it, whether or not that treatment is actually going to be beneficial and help us live longer. So I think it's like a quarter of all medical spending goes to people who are essentially, we know they're on their last month or two of life, but we just kind of want to keep them alive for what reasons we're not quite sure, just because that seems like a good idea. So I think it's really,
I'll tell you what I think it is.
Rule number 8, do hard things.
This myth of Misogi, there's this guy, Izanagi, and his wife dies and she descends into the underworld. They're both gods in the Shinto faith. And he can't live without her. So he decides, I'm going down into the underworld. I'm going into hell. I'm going to save my wife. Now he gets down there and it's hell. It's perilous. There's like all these, in the story it talks about, there's all these demons that like grab at him and are trying to keep him down. And then he has to escape. It's kind of a somewhat sad story because he gets down there and he realizes that his wife has now become a demon. But now he's like, okay, I got to get back to the normal world, right? Because he's going to die down there. So he has to make this like fantastic escape up through the underworld. He doesn't think he's going to make it. He faces these like real trials, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, all that stuff. But he makes it out. And when he gets out, he goes under this waterfall. And this waterfall is this act of purification. So it's your basic hero's myth, right? And you see these hero's myths throughout time and space. Joseph Campbell identified a lot of them. And what they all are, they have a basic formula. And that is, the hero leaves the comfort of home. They go into this trying middle ground. And in that middle ground, they really struggle, they battle, they face demons, dragons, all these different things. But they make it out. And by making it out, they become a new person. They reach a stage of enlightenment. They realize something about themselves and their potential, right? So you see this kind of story throughout time and space. One of these guys that I meet and talk about in the book is named Marcus Elliott. So one thing to know about him is he's a little far out. He went to Burning Man like back in the day when it was this little weird thing in the desert. I mean, that's like the ultimate mark of someone who's a little bit of a seeker, right? But he's also brilliant. He went to Harvard, got his MD. He decides he doesn't want to be a standard doctor. He wants to get into sports science. He wants to revolutionize the field. This is in the early 2000s. And he pretty much does. So he kicks around with a few different teams, helps the Patriots win some championships. And then he opens his own facility. And it's, long story short, it's really based on like big data, biometrics. They're looking at how people move, putting it in algorithms. I mean, it's kind of the future. So he's really smart, really number-centric. But back to that idea that he's, a little bit of a seeker. He also understands that what really improves human performance and potential, you can't always measure that stuff, right? It's like, why is it sometimes that there's like this NBA player who, maybe isn't the buffest on the court or doesn't look the fittest, but just has this gear in their brain where they can go, oh, clutch time? Yeah, give me the ball. We got this, right? Like, what is that? So to get to these sort of intangibles, they do this thing called misogi, and it's based on that ancient myth. So once a year, these guys, it'll be Marcus, handful of other people. Some of them are, pro athletes at the highest level. Some of them are like successful artists, doctors, just random motley mix of people. They'll go out and they'll do something super hard in nature. And it's usually something a little bit wacky. So one year they get this 85-pound boulder and they walk it 5 miles underneath the Santa Barbara Channel. They've also done stuff like they don't really know how to stand up paddleboard, but we're going to stand up paddleboard like a ton of miles, right? Now, there are only 2 rules to misogi. Rule number 1 is that it has to be really hard. And they define that really hard by saying you have a true 50% chance of making it. So nowadays, we tend to take on challenges where we're like, I'm going to do this. And if we think we can't, what do? We train for like months until we're like 90% confident we're going to make it, right? No, this is like, we're not training. This is, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this. Let's go see if we can do it. And then rule number 2 is that you can't die. And that one's pretty straightforward. And it's really mimicking that idea of the hero's myth, where it's like we're throwing ourselves into this zone of discomfort where we don't know if we can do this. And while they're out there, it's like you're going to reach this, you're going to see this edge. You're like, I can't do this anymore. There's no way we're going to be able to finish this. Like, I'm spent. Let's get ready to tap out. But by putting one foot in front of the other or continuing to paddle or whatever it is, you get beyond that edge. And then you can look back and be like, well, wait a minute here. I'm looking back at what I thought was my edge. And like, I've obviously sold myself short here, right? Like I had an inaccurate measurement of my potential. And then it's like, well, what else am I selling myself short in life, right? So it makes you answer some hard questions.
Rule number 9, use the survival advantage.
So there's these 2 professors at Harvard, and they're traveling to a conference, right? And they're in line for TSA. They're looking at TSA. What does TSA do? The beepers go off, and they're like, they think that this banana that you've packed in your bag is a Beretta. So they're going to tear that damn thing apart. They frisk some old woman who can't see or walk because there's like a half-filled bottle of water. They're just always looking for problems. And so they wonder if all of a sudden, like, the scanners never went off, ever. Everyone just obeyed the TSA rules 100%. What would they do? Would people just sail through without problems? And they didn't think so, because the TSA's job is to find problems. They thought they would start searching for problems even when the problems don't exist. So they do a study, because they're these Harvard psychologists. They got a question, right? So now it's time to do a study. They get a bunch of people, and they show them 800 different faces. And the people have one job, and that is to determine whether the faces they are looking at are threatening or non-threatening. Seemingly very black or white, right? So they start showing them these faces, so you go threatening, non-threatening, threatening, threatening, non-threatening. But after about the 200th face, they start showing people fewer and fewer threatening faces. They did a similar thing, and it was, they would have them read research proposals, and they would say, is this ethical or unethical, what these researchers are proposing? Same deal. After about the 50th or 100th proposal, they started giving them fewer and fewer unethical proposals. So you would think that, if we really saw black and white, this is like a clear judgment of like, does this person make me feel threatened? Or does this research proposal cross this like moral line in the sand that I have drawn and I am firm on? Then they would start saying threatening less times. They would start saying ethical more times, right? As the thing went on. That didn't actually happen. The ratio stayed the exact same. So they basically started saying that faces that were seemingly non-threatening were threatening, and that research proposals that they would have deemed ethical were unethical. So this basically showed that as humans face fewer and fewer problems in our lives, we don't actually experience fewer problems. We just redefine what a problem is. And it's because as the world has gotten better, so think back even in 100 years, we've got climate control now. We've got cars. We've got cell phones. We've got all the streets are paved. How many people listening to this podcast work on a farm for a living and go out there and till it all day? Not many, right? You probably sit behind a desk. You're pretty safe, right? The world has clearly gotten better. But we don't actually see that because our brain has this low-level mechanism that's always running to find the next problem. And this made sense in our past because if you're a hunter-gatherer and you don't know where your food is coming from, you're not quite sure about shelter tonight, life is actually dangerous. If you can just focus on problems all the time, that's going to give you a survival advantage. But in today's world, where arguably there's still problems in the world, don't get me wrong, but I think that overall, things are pretty good. We don't actually see that.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is be happy.
I traveled to Bhutan, which is this country right next to Nepal in India. And it's a really interesting place because it is one of the least developed countries on earth. It's measured by GDP. There's not a stoplight in the country. That'll kind of give you a sense there, you know?
Sure. Yeah. In the entire country. I mean, I grew up in a town without a stoplight, but you're talking about the entire country now.
Talking about the entire country. Yep.
Right.
The entire country. There's no outside businesses. There's not like Wendy's or Starbucks or McDonald's or any of that. But what's interesting is they consistently rank in the top 20 happiest countries on earth. They consistently rank really high in happiness rankings, usually in the top 20. And part of the reason for this, they think there's a lot of stuff going on, but is that they are a lot more aware of their own mortality. So in Bhutan, people are told to think about their death every day, anywhere from 1 to 3 times. There's these reminders that you're going to die across the country. So things like their cultural art and things like dances center around death. There's all these little clay pyramids that are mixed with clay and ashes of the dead that are like everywhere.
Really?
Right. Yeah. And when I say everywhere, I mean, they're in every windowsill, like they are along roadsides. They're just everywhere. So it's this constant reminder. And, when I was there, I met with a lot of different people sort of thinking about this, but I met with this guy who's really high up in the Buddhist faith. And he lives like basically in a shack next to this monastery. And me and my driver, you have to hire a driver there. We drive up this like dirt cliff road and it's this crazy drive. And I get there and this guy lives in like a shack with, really not much in it. And I get in there and he's a Buddhist monk. It's like this scene out of like, you would just picture the most cliche scene you can think of, like of a Western writer going to meet this guy,
right? Interesting.
Yeah. And, I talked to him for a long time and he told me that in the US, a lot of people, not everyone, of course, but we tend to think that items and titles and things like that and kind of doing the next thing on the list is what is going to make us happy. Right. And we kind of, it's like, oh, once I do this, I'll be happy. Once I buy this, I'll be happy. And when we get those things, we just add more to the list. So we're in this constant chase. And he says, picture that there's a cliff in 500 feet. And we're all walking towards it right now. And that cliff is death. Now you can ignore that, or you can be aware of that. And by being aware of that, it changes your behavior because all of a sudden you can be like, well, I'm going to pay attention to the beauty around the cliff. I'm going to have different conversations with the people I live with. So by sort of being aware of, your death, it changes people's behavior for the better. And what's really interesting is there is studies in the US that have backed this up where they will, have people think about death and another group think about something else. And the people who think about their death report being happier, which is like super counterintuitive, right?
Now I've got a special bonus clip that I think you're gonna enjoy. But before that, it's time for the question of the day. I wanna know, what was your single biggest takeaway from this video and your plan of action for the next week? When you watch a video and just get motivated, the science says you have a 35% chance of actually following through on your goals. That's not good enough. No, not for you, Believe Nation. We gotta do something. But when you write it down
and you create a specific plan of action for the next week, that number jumps to 91% chance of you following through. And when you commit to somebody else, like leaving a comment on this video, it jumps to 95%. You need to follow through on your goals. So what was your single biggest takeaway from this video and your specific plan of action for the next week? Put it down in the comments below so I can celebrate you.
In reporting this book, I spent a little more than a month up in the Arctic backcountry on a backcountry hunt. So, you know, up there it's freezing cold. We had days that were -20. Anytime we wanted anything, it took effort. Just getting water for food and to drink, we had to hike down to this stream and get it. And by the way, the stream is, you know, where the grizzly bears also hang out. We're carrying 80-pound packs on our backs the whole time. Hungry. I was so damn hungry because we could only pack in so much food, yet we're burning like 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day. Even just being in that solitude and silence of nature is uncomfortable, you know, exposed to the elements. But what was fascinating is, like, you would think that I would be a damn mess the whole time, you know, that I would be just super anxious and worrisome. And the truth is that, like, I felt more alive than I'd ever felt in my life. I also felt a lot calmer, and there are a variety of reasons for that. One is that we know that different doses of nature are great for people getting out to the wild. I'm also like facing these evolutionary challenges that we used to in our past. And that seemed to trigger something inside people. And when I got back from that trip, it's like, man, I just felt more alive, more calm, more zen than I'd ever felt. And I had a newfound perspective on life.
If you want to see the top 10 I did on David Goggins, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
The most important conversation you'll ever have is the one you have with yourself. With all these failures and all these bullies and all these being abused and my learning disabilities,